The cold splash hit her like 1,000 needles, shocking Hannah Daniels into consciousness just as the murky waters of the Brazos River closed over her head. The rope binding her wrists cut into her flesh as she struggled against the current, her lungs already burning for air. It was 1875 in Desdemona, Texas, and Hannah was certain these would be her final moments. Frank Yates had been following the winding riverbank on horseback when he spotted the commotion ahead. 3 men at the river's edge, laughing and mounting their horses as someone thrashed in the water. Frank didn't hesitate. He leapt from his stallion, tore off his gun belt, and dove into the churning water. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling at his clothes as he swam toward the struggling figure. He could see her now, a woman with auburn hair fanning out in the water, her bound hands creating white splashes as she fought to stay afloat. Frank reached her just as she began to sink, wrapping one strong arm around her waist while treading water. "I've got you," he shouted over the rush of the river. Her eyes were wide with terror, lips already taking on a bluish tinge. Frank reached for the knife he kept in his boot, thankfully still there, and with a few sawing motions, cut through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment her hands were free, she clung to him desperately, coughing and gasping. Fighting the current, Frank swam toward the shore, pulling the half-conscious woman with him. When his boots finally touched the riverbed, he lifted her into his arms and carried her the rest of the way, collapsing onto the sandy bank. "Breathe," he urged as she sputtered and coughed up river water. Hannah's throat burned as she expelled the river from her lungs, each breath a struggle. Through blurred vision, she saw her rescuer tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair plastered to his face, water streaming from his drenched clothes. When she could finally speak, her voice emerged as a rasp. They'll come back," she managed. Frank surveyed the opposite bank where the men had disappeared. "Not if they know what's good for them." He helped her to sit up. "Who were they? Why would they do this?" Hannah shivered, partly from the cold water and partly from the memory of being thrown into the river. "Dunbar's men. I refused his offer to buy my father's land." She looked down at her wrists, raw and bleeding from the ropes. "He said he'd make an example of me." Frank's jaw tightened. He knew of Maxwell Dunbar, a cattle baron who'd been buying up properties around Desdemona by any means necessary. "I'm Frank Yates," he said, removing his soaked vest and wringing it out. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles south of here." "Hannah Daniels," she replied, teeth chattering. "My father's homestead was northeast of town." Frank noted her use of past tense but didn't press. Instead, he helped her to her feet. "We need to get you warmed up before you catch your death. My horse is just up the bank." Hannah tried to take a step, but her legs gave way beneath her. Without hesitation, Frank swept her into his arms. "I've got you, Miss Daniels. You're safe now." The ride to Frank's ranch was slow and quiet. Hannah sat in front of him on the saddle, his arms around her as he held the reins, her body gradually absorbing the warmth of his chest against her back. By the time they arrived at his modest but well-kept ranch house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the Texas landscape. Frank's housekeeper, a middle-aged Mexican woman named Rosa, took one look at the bedraggled pair and immediately began fussing over Hannah, insisting she change into dry clothes, a shirt, and trousers belonging to Frank's younger sister, who occasionally visited from Austin. As Hannah sat wrapped in blankets before the fireplace, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands, Frank entered from the kitchen where he'd been conferring with Rosa. "She's making up a room for you," he said, taking a seat in the chair opposite her. He'd changed into dry clothes as well, his hair still damp but combed back from his face. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Hannah looked up from her cup. Thank you, Mr. Yates, but I can't impose. Once I'm warmed up, I should what? Frank interrupted gently. Go back to a place where Dunbar's men can find you again. He leaned forward. Miss Daniels, I don't know what happened before today, but I do know that Maxwell Dunbar doesn't take kindly to being refused. If he's set his sights on you or your land, he won't stop at one attempt. Hannah's shoulders slumped. My father died last month. Pneumonia. The homestead belongs to me now, but Dunbar came calling not 3 days after the funeral, said a woman had no business trying to run a farm alone. Her green eyes flashed with anger. I told him I'd manage just fine. That's when the threats started. Frank nodded. He'd heard similar stories from other small landowners in the area. And today, they came while I was tending the vegetable garden, 3 of them. Hannah's voice trembled slightly. They said Mr. Dunbar had reconsidered his offer he'd take the land for free now that I'd been so uncooperative. When I reached for my father's shotgun, they overpowered me. She swallowed hard. They tied my hands and threw me in the back of their wagon. Said they were going to teach me what happens to stubborn women in these parts. Frank's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Sounds like Dunbar's usual tactics. He's been pushing folks out all over the county. Why doesn't the sheriff do anything? Hannah asked. Frank gave a humorless laugh. Sheriff Patterson, he's in Dunbar's pocket, same as the mayor and half the town council. He set his cup down. The way I see it, you have 2 choices. You can sell the land and move on, maybe to Fort Worth or Dallas where Dunbar can't reach you. Or what? Hannah asked when he paused. Or you fight. Frank's eyes met hers. But if you choose to fight, you'll need allies. That night, Hannah slept fitfully despite the comfortable bed Rosa had prepared for her. Nightmares of drowning, of rough hands shoving her into the river, jolted her awake several times. During one such awakening, she heard soft voices from downstairs, Frank speaking with someone who had apparently arrived late. Curiosity getting the better of her, Hannah slipped from bed and crept to the top of the stairs. Below in the main room, Frank stood with another man, both examining what appeared to be a map spread across the table. Dunbar's men were seen near the Wilkinson place yesterday, the visitor was saying. Old man Jenkins sold out last week. Got run off his property when his barn mysteriously caught fire. And Hannah Daniels? Frank asked, his voice low but clear in the quiet house. Word is Dunbar sent Henley and the Cartwright brothers to persuade her. They haven't reported back yet. Frank's laugh held no humor. That's because they were too busy trying to drown her in the Brazos this afternoon. He traced a line on the map. She's here now, and I aim to keep her safe. The visitor whistled low. You fished her out of the river. Dunbar won't take kindly to that, Frank. Dunbar can go to hell, Frank replied evenly. I'm tired of watching him swallow up this county one homestead at a time. Hannah retreated silently to her room, her mind whirling. It seemed Frank Yates was more than just a good Samaritan who'd happened upon her at the right moment. He was apparently someone who'd been watching Dunbar's movements, perhaps even organizing some kind of resistance. The next morning, Hannah awoke to the smell of bacon and coffee. She dressed in the borrowed clothes which fit reasonably well, though the trousers were a bit long, and made her way downstairs. Rosa greeted her warmly and ushered her to the table where a hearty breakfast awaited. Frank entered moments later, looking as though he'd already been up for hours. His face brightened when he saw her. Miss Daniels, how are you feeling this morning? Much better, thank you, she replied, though her wrist still stung from the rope burns. Mr. Yates, I wanted to ask, what happens now? Frank sat across from her, accepting a cup of coffee from Rosa. That depends on what you want, Miss Daniels. Please call me Hannah. She met his gaze steadily. And what I want is my land, my home. Frank nodded as though he'd expected this answer. Then we'll need to make sure Dunbar understands you're not alone anymore. He hesitated. Hannah, I should tell you I've been gathering information on Dunbar for months. His business dealings, his tactics, the properties he's acquired. Sometimes through legitimate means, often not. You're building a case against him, Hannah realized, trying to, but the local law won't touch him. I've been corresponding with a federal marshal in Austin who's interested, but we need more proof of his illegal activities. Frank leaned forward. Your situation, what happened to you yesterday, that could be the evidence we need. Hannah considered this. You want me to testify against Maxwell Dunbar, the man who just tried to have me killed? I know it's asking a lot, Frank admitted. But if enough people stand together, if we can get the federal authorities involved. He trailed off, then shook his head. I'm sorry. You've been through hell, and here I am trying to recruit you for a fight that isn't yours. Isn't it? Hannah's voice was quiet but firm. He tried to take my land. He had his men throw me into a river to drown. She pushed her plate away, appetite gone. Mr. Yates, Frank, I owe you my life. The least I can do is help you stop Dunbar from hurting anyone else. Something flickered in Frank's eyes, admiration, perhaps, or something deeper. In that case, he said, rising from the table, I think it's time you met the others. Later that day, Frank led Hannah to a small cabin about a mile from his main house, hidden among a grove of oak trees. Inside, 5 people were gathered around a large table, 3 men and 2 women, all looking up expectantly as they entered. Everyone, this is Hannah Daniels, Frank announced. Dunbar's men tried to drown her yesterday. She's agreed to help us. He turned to Hannah. Hannah, meet what we jokingly call the Desdemona resistance. One by one, Frank introduced them. Elijah Turner, a former lawyer whose practice had been ruined when he refused to falsify documents for Dunbar. Maria and Carlos Vasquez, whose family ranch had been burned out when they refused to sell. Benjamin Howard, a shopkeeper who'd been supplying them with information from town. And Sarah Wilson, a widow whose husband had died under mysterious circumstances after standing up to Dunbar at a town meeting. We've been gathering evidence, Elijah explained, showing Hannah a ledger full of names, dates, and detailed accounts of Dunbar's activities. Properties acquired through intimidation, suspicious fires, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories or disappeared altogether. And now attempted murder, Frank added, placing a hand on Hannah's shoulder. Hannah can testify to what Dunbar's men did to her. Sarah approached Hannah, taking her hands gently. We're grateful for your courage, Miss Daniels. Many would have sold out and left after what you experienced. Hannah's gaze traveled around the room, taking in these people who had all suffered losses at Dunbar's hands, yet remained to fight. My father built our homestead with his own hands. He taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The meeting continued for hours as they discussed strategy. The federal marshal Frank had contacted a man named Porter would be arriving in 3 days. Their plan was to compile all their evidence, including Hannah's testimony, and present it to him in hopes that he would take action against Dunbar where the local authorities would not. As they rode back to Frank's ranch in the fading afternoon light, Hannah found herself studying his profile against the setting sun. In just over 24 hours, this man had not only saved her life, but had shown her that she wasn't alone in her fight against injustice. Frank, she said suddenly, why did you dive into the river yesterday? You didn't know me. You could have ridden for help instead of risking your life. Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. I saw a woman in trouble, he finally said. There wasn't time to think about it. Most men would have thought about it, Hannah persisted. Most men would have decided it wasn't their problem. Frank turned in his saddle to look at her, his expression serious. "My father taught me that a man is judged not by what he says or thinks, but by what he does when action is needed." A small smile touched his lips. "Besides, I've been watching Dunbar's operation long enough to know that anyone he's against is probably someone worth knowing." Hannah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "Well, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons." The next morning, Frank suggested they ride into town to check on Hannah's homestead. "We should see what condition it's in," he explained as they saddled their horses. "And you'll need some of your own clothes, I expect." Hannah nodded, though apprehension knotted her stomach at the thought of returning to the place where she'd been attacked. Still, she couldn't hide at Frank's ranch forever. They approached the Daniels homestead cautiously, Frank insisting they circle the property first to ensure none of Dunbar's men were lying in wait. The small farm looked peaceful enough, a modest cabin with a barn and corral, surrounded by fields that were starting to show neglect after days without tending. "The animals," Hannah gasped, suddenly remembering her father's 2 milk cows, the chickens, and her horse. They found the livestock safe but hungry. While Frank saw to feeding and watering them, Hannah entered the cabin, bracing herself for what she might find. To her relief, the interior was largely undisturbed. She quickly gathered some clothes and personal items, including her father's pocket watch and her mother's wedding ring, the only keepsakes she had of her parents. As she was about to leave, Hannah noticed something on the kitchen table that hadn't been there before, an official-looking document weighed down by a rock. She picked it up, her blood running cold as she read. "Frank," she called, her voice tight with alarm. He appeared in the doorway moments later, hat in hand. "What is it?" Hannah thrust the paper at him. "They've filed a claim saying I abandoned the property. According to this, if I don't appear before Judge Walton by tomorrow afternoon to contest it, the land will be declared abandoned and open for claim." Her hands trembled with rage. "They tried to kill me, and now they're trying to steal my land through legal channels." Frank's expression darkened as he read the document. Judge Walton is another one in Dunbar's pocket. This was their backup plan if drowning you didn't work. They just take the land through corrupt legal means. Hannah began pacing the small kitchen. "Then I have to appear tomorrow. I have to show them I'm very much alive and still claim this land." Frank caught her arm gently. "Hannah, that would be walking straight into danger. Dunbar's men will be watching the courthouse." "What choice do I have?" She gestured around the cabin. "This is all I have left of my family. I can't let them take it without a fight." Frank was silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but you won't go alone, and we'll need to be smart about this." He glanced out the window at the setting sun. "We should get back to the ranch. We need to talk to Elijah. He'll know the legal angles we can use." That evening, the entire resistance gathered at Frank's ranch to formulate a plan. Elijah examined the abandonment notice carefully, his legal training evident in his methodical approach. "The good news," he said after a thorough reading, "is that this document is full of procedural errors. Judge Walton may be corrupt, but he's still a judge. If we point out these discrepancies in open court with witnesses present, he'll have a hard time ignoring them." "And the bad news?" Hannah asked. Elijah's expression grew grave. "The bad news is that Dunbar won't take this lying down. If he loses in court, he might resort to more direct methods again." Carlos Vasquez, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "So we protect Miss Daniels, all of us together." He looked around the room, receiving nods of agreement. "Dunbar has his men, but now we are many too." They spent hours planning their approach for the next day. Benjamin would spread word in town about the hearing, ensuring a large crowd of witnesses. Maria and Sarah would accompany Hannah to the courthouse, providing both moral support and safety in numbers. Carlos and Elijah would be positioned near the courthouse, watching for any of Dunbar's men while Frank. "I'll be confronting Dunbar directly," Frank stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Hannah stared at him in alarm. "That's too dangerous. You said yourself he's not above murder." Frank's gaze was steady as he met her eyes. "Which is why I need to keep his attention on me while you're in the courthouse. He won't expect a direct confrontation. He's used to working from the shadows." Hannah wanted to protest further, but the determination in Frank's expression told her it would be futile. Instead, she found herself admiring his courage, even as she feared for his safety. Later, after the others had gone and Rosa had retired for the night, Hannah found Frank on the front porch, staring out at the star-filled Texas sky. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said softly. "Any of it. You've already done more than enough by saving my life." Frank turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. "Yes, I do. Dunbar has been terrorizing this county for too long. Someone has to stand up to him." "Why you?" The question came out before Hannah could stop it. A sad smile touched Frank's lips. "3 years ago, my brother owned a small silver mine west of here. Dunbar wanted it. When James refused to sell, there was an accident in the mine. My brother and 5 others died." His voice grew tight with emotion. "I couldn't prove Dunbar was behind it, but I knew. That's when I started gathering evidence, building a case against him." Hannah's hand found his on the porch railing. "I'm so sorry, Frank." He looked down at their hands, then gently turned his to hold hers. "What happened to you, that was my fault. I've been too cautious, too slow in building my case. If I'd moved against Dunbar sooner, maybe you wouldn't have." "Stop," Hannah interrupted. "What happened to me is Dunbar's fault, not yours. And if they hadn't thrown me in that river, I never would have met you." The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than she'd intended. Frank's eyes searched hers in the dim light. For a moment, Hannah thought he might kiss her and realized with a start that she wanted him to. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently. "We should both get some rest," he said, his voice low. "Tomorrow will be a long day." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and hot, typical for late summer in Texas. Hannah dressed in her own clothes, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, freshly ironed by Rosa, and tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach. The plan was set in motion early. Benjamin had already left for town to spread word about the hearing. Carlos and Elijah rode ahead to take up their positions near the courthouse, while Maria and Sarah would accompany Hannah in Frank's wagon. Frank himself would follow later, timing his arrival to coincide with Dunbar's usual mid-morning visit to the Desdemona Bank. As the women prepared to leave, Frank pulled Hannah aside. "Remember," he said, his voice tense with concern, "stick to the plan. Don't let Walton rush you. Make sure every error in that document is addressed publicly." Hannah nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I will, just be careful with Dunbar." Something flickered in Frank's eyes, a softening that made Hannah's heart skip. "I will," he promised, then, hesitantly, he reached out to touch her cheek. "Hannah, when this is over." "Yes," she prompted when he paused. Frank seemed to catch himself, dropping his hand. "We'll talk when this is over," he said finally. "Good luck in court." The ride into Desdemona was tense but uneventful. Hannah sat between Maria and Sarah in the wagon, rehearsing what Elijah had coached her to say. As they approached the town, Hannah could see that Benjamin had done his job well. A crowd was already gathering outside the small courthouse, curious about the proceedings. Judge Walton's face showed clear surprise when Hannah walked into the courtroom, flanked by Maria and Sarah. He recovered quickly, however, adjusting his spectacles and shuffling his papers. "Miss Daniels," he drawled, "we had information that you had abandoned your property." Hannah stood tall, her voice steady as she replied, "As you can see, Your Honor, I am very much present and still in possession of my land." The hearing proceeded, with Hannah methodically pointing out each error in the abandonment notice, just as Elijah had instructed. The fact that the notice gave her only 3 days to respond when the law required at least 10. The absence of proper signatures from county officials. The lack of documented attempts to locate her before filing the notice. Judge Walton grew increasingly uncomfortable as Hannah spoke, especially as the crowded courtroom murmured in agreement with her points. It was clear that Dunbar's legal maneuver was falling apart in the face of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, across town, Frank timed his arrival at the Desdemona Bank and Trust to coincide with Maxwell Dunbar's regular visit. Dunbar was just emerging from the bank when Frank approached, blocking his path to the waiting carriage. "Yates," Dunbar acknowledged with a cold smile. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of weathered tan that came from years of overseeing others work rather than doing it himself. "To what do I owe this pleasure? I think you know why I'm here, Dunbar," Frank replied, loud enough for passers-by to hear. "Hannah Daniels is alive." "Your men failed." Dunbar's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. Now, if you'll excuse me—" "No, I won't excuse you," Frank interrupted, stepping closer. "Not for trying to drown an innocent woman. Not for trying to steal her land. Not for the dozens of other properties you've taken through intimidation and violence." Dunbar's expression hardened. "Be careful, Yates. Accusations like that could be considered slander." "It's not slander if it's true," Frank countered. "And I have proof witnesses, documents, testimonies. The federal marshal arriving tomorrow will be very interested in what I have to share." A flash of genuine alarm crossed Dunbar's face before he could mask it. "You're bluffing," he said, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Frank stood his ground. "Try me. Or better yet, why don't you join us at the courthouse? Hannah Daniels is there right now, explaining to Judge Walton and half the town exactly what your men did to her." Dunbar's composure slipped further. He glanced toward the courthouse, then back at Frank, calculation in his eyes. "You've made a serious mistake, Yates," he said, his voice low and threatening. "This isn't over." As Dunbar pushed past him toward the courthouse, Frank smiled grimly. The first part of the plan had worked. Dunbar was rattled. And now he was heading straight into a public situation where he couldn't easily intimidate or threaten anyone. Back at the courthouse, Judge Walton was clearly searching for a way to rule against Hannah despite the overwhelming evidence in her favor, when the doors burst open and Maxwell Dunbar strode in, his face tight with anger. A hush fell over the courtroom as Dunbar made his way to the front, nodding curtly to Judge Walton before turning to face Hannah. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice deceptively pleasant, "I'm relieved to see you well. There seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding regarding your property." Hannah stood firm, bolstered by Maria and Sarah's presence beside her and the supportive murmurs from the crowd. "The only misunderstanding, Mr. Dunbar, was your belief that you could take my land through illegal means." Dunbar's smile tightened. "I assure you, I had nothing to do with this filing. One of my associates must have acted overzealously. I'll be sure to discipline them accordingly." Just then, Frank entered the courtroom, taking a position at the back where he could observe the proceedings. Dunbar noticed him immediately, a flash of hatred crossing his features before he schooled his expression back to one of benign concern. Judge Walton cleared his throat nervously. "Well, given the irregularities in the filing, and Miss Daniels' clear intention to maintain possession of her property, I have no choice but to dismiss this abandonment notice." He banged his gavel hastily, as if eager to end the proceedings before they became even more complicated. A cheer went up from the spectators, many of whom had suffered similar intimidation tactics from Dunbar in the past. Hannah felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew this was only one small victory in a larger battle. Dunbar, sensing the shift in public opinion, attempted to save face. "I'm pleased justice has been served," he announced loudly. "As I said, this was all a misunderstanding." He turned to Hannah. "Miss Daniels, please accept my personal apology. Perhaps we could discuss a fair price for your property at a later date. I assure you my interest is purely business." Hannah's response was clear and firm. "Mr. Dunbar, my land is not for sale. Not now, not ever." The courtroom erupted in approving murmurs and applause. Dunbar's face darkened momentarily before he forced another tight smile and made his way out of the courthouse, deliberately avoiding Frank as he passed. Frank approached Hannah as the crowd began to disperse, pride evident in his expression. "You did it," he said, taking her hands in his. "You stood your ground." Hannah smiled up at him, feeling stronger than she had in days. "We did it, all of us together." She glanced around at their allies Maria, Sarah, Carlos, and Elijah, who had joined them inside, and Benjamin, who was busy spreading the news of Hannah's victory to everyone who would listen. "This is just the beginning," Frank cautioned as they left the courthouse. "Dunbar won't give up easily. But with Marshal Porter arriving tomorrow, and your testimony about what happened at the river, we might finally have enough to bring him down legally." Hannah nodded, sobered by the reminder that their fight was far from over. "Will you take me home now, to my farm? I need to see to my animals, and there's so much work to catch up on." Frank hesitated. "It might not be safe yet. Dunbar's men will be watching my property, I know," Hannah finished for him. "But I can't hide forever, Frank. That farm is all I have left of my parents. I need to take care of it." Frank studied her determined expression and finally nodded. "All right. But I'm staying with you, at least until we know what Dunbar's next move will be." They said goodbye to the others, arranging to meet at Frank's ranch the following day when Marshal Porter was due to arrive. As Frank and Hannah rode toward her homestead, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of their horses' hooves and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. The Daniels farm looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, showing no signs of disturbance since their visit the day before. Still, Frank insisted on checking the cabin and outbuildings before allowing Hannah inside. When he was satisfied that no one was lying in wait, they set about caring for the animals and assessing what work needed to be done. As the sun began to set, Hannah prepared a simple meal from the supplies they'd brought from Frank's ranch. They ate on the front porch, watching the Texas sky transform into a canvas of orange and purple hues. "My father used to say that a Texas sunset was God's way of showing off," Hannah said, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "He loved this land so much, worked himself to the bone for it." Frank nodded in understanding. "My father was the same way about our ranch, said a man could find everything he needed in a piece of good Texas soil." He glanced at her. "Your father would be proud of you, Hannah, standing up to Dunbar the way you did today." Hannah felt tears threaten at the mention of her father. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to keep this place going on my own." Frank's hand found hers on the porch railing. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Hannah Daniels, but you don't have to do it alone." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Hannah felt that same warmth she'd experienced on Frank's porch the night before. This time, however, there was no hesitation in Frank's expression. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Hannah closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened with shared emotion. When they finally broke apart, Frank rested his forehead against hers, his voice husky. "I've wanted to do that since I pulled you from that river." Hannah smiled, her heart racing. "I think I've wanted you to since the moment I opened my eyes and saw you standing over me on that riverbank." Frank brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Hannah, when this is all over, when Dunbar is dealt with, I want to court you properly, if you'll allow it." Hannah's answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and a future neither of them had dared imagine just days ago. Their peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Frank was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his gun as he scanned the darkness beyond the porch. "Get inside," he urged Hannah, but it was too late. 5 riders emerged from the shadows surrounding the cabin. In the lead was a man Hannah recognized with dread: Henley, one of the men who had thrown her into the river. "Well, ain't this sweet?" Henley drawled, his revolver already drawn. The little lady and her rescuer, all cozy-like. Frank positioned himself slightly in front of Hannah, his voice steady. "You're trespassing on Miss Daniels' property. I suggest you leave while you still can." Henley laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet evening. "Hear that, boys?" "We're trespassing." His expression hardened. "Mr. Dunbar sends his regards, Miss Daniels. Says he's mighty disappointed in how things went today." "Dunbar lost," Frank stated firmly. "Fair and square in front of the whole town. If he had any sense, he'd cut his losses and leave Miss Daniels alone." "See, that's the problem with you, Yates," Henley said, dismounting slowly. The other riders followed suit, spreading out to block any escape routes. "You think this is about playing fair. Mr. Dunbar doesn't care about fair. He cares about results." Hannah's hand found Frank's arm, gripping it tightly as fear coursed through her. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and far from any help. Frank's mind raced, calculating their options. The cabin had only 2 exits: the front door where they stood and a back door leading to the vegetable garden. Both were covered by Dunbar's men. Fighting would be suicide. "What does Dunbar want?" Frank asked, playing for time. Henley gestured toward Hannah. "Her signature on a deed transfer. Right now, Mr. Dunbar's patience is all used up. And if I refuse—" Hannah's voice was remarkably steady despite her fear. Henley's smile was cold. "Then we finish what we started at the river. Only this time we make sure you don't come back up. And your knight in shining armor here gets to join you." Frank felt Hannah stiffen beside him. Before he could formulate a response, a single gunshot rang out from the darkness beyond the gathered men, sending Henley's hat flying from his head. "The next one goes between your eyes, Henley," came a familiar voice, and Frank could have laughed with relief. Carlos Vasquez stepped into the light, rifle aimed steadily at Henley's head. Behind him emerged Elijah, Benjamin, and to Frank's surprise, at least a dozen other men and women from town, all armed, all with expressions of grim determination. "What the hell is this?" Henley demanded, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. "This," Frank said with a smile, "is what happens when a community stands together against a bully." One of Dunbar's men made a move for his weapon, but another warning shot, this one from Benjamin's direction, stopped him cold. "I wouldn't," Benjamin advised calmly. "There are more of us than you can see. We've had enough of Dunbar's tactics in this county." Elijah stepped forward, his lawyer's voice clear and authoritative. "You men have 2 choices. You can leave now peacefully and tell Dunbar his days of terrorizing this community are over. Or you can try to fight and end up either dead or in jail when Marshal Porter arrives tomorrow." Henley looked around, taking in the number of armed townspeople surrounding them. His bravado wavered visibly. "This ain't over," he snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Dunbar won't stand for this." "Dunbar doesn't have a choice anymore," Frank replied. "The federal marshal will have more than enough evidence to arrest him by this time tomorrow. His reign over Desdemona is finished." The men mounted their horses, Henley giving one last venomous glare before they galloped off into the night. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded did Frank allow himself to breathe again, pulling Hannah into a tight embrace. "Are you all right?" he murmured against her hair. She nodded against his chest, then pulled back to look at their unexpected saviors. "How did you know?" Carlos stepped onto the porch, resting his rifle against the railing. "We didn't. But after today's confrontation, we figured Dunbar might try something. We've been taking turns watching your property since you left town." "And the others?" Frank gestured to the townspeople who were now emerging fully from their hiding places around the farm. Benjamin grinned. "Word spreads fast in a small town. After what happened in court today, people are finally ready to stand up to Dunbar. These folks volunteered to help keep watch tonight." Hannah was overwhelmed by the show of support. "I don't know how to thank you all," she said, her voice thick with emotion. An older farmer whom Hannah recognized from town tipped his hat to her. "No need for thanks, Miss Daniels. What Dunbar's men did to you trying to drown you like that it was a bridge too far made folks realize it could be any of us next." The impromptu gathering turned into a sort of council of war, with people sharing stories of Dunbar's intimidation tactics and discussing how they would present their case to Marshal Porter. Frank sent 2 men back to town to spread word that Dunbar's men had tried and failed to intimidate Hannah again, a move calculated to further erode Dunbar's power in the community. By midnight, most had departed, leaving only Carlos, Elijah, and Benjamin to keep watch for the remainder of the night. Frank and Hannah retired to the cabin, both exhausted but filled with a new sense of hope. "You think it will work?" Hannah asked as they sat by the fireplace, the events of the day catching up with them both. "Will the marshal really be able to arrest Dunbar?" Frank stoked the fire thoughtfully. "With your testimony about the attempted drowning, plus all the evidence we've gathered of his other crimes, yes, I believe he will. Dunbar's made enemies in high places, 2 wealthy cattle barons who resent his methods. They'll be happy to see him fall." Hannah leaned against Frank's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I still can't believe what happened tonight. All those people, willing to risk themselves to protect me, to protect this land." "That's the thing about bullies like Dunbar," Frank said, wrapping an arm around her. "They rule through fear and isolation. Once people realize they're not alone, that they can stand together, the fear loses its power." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Eventually, Hannah looked up at Frank, her expression serious. "Earlier, before Dunbar's men arrived, you said you wanted to court me when this is all over." Frank nodded, suddenly uncertain. "If that's what you want to." Hannah's hand found his, fingers intertwining. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "that life is too uncertain to wait for the perfect moment. After nearly drowning after tonight, I don't want to waste time." Frank's breath caught as he understood her meaning. "Hannah, are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Frank Yates," she stated simply. "I know it's fast, maybe too fast by most standards, but when you pulled me from that river, you didn't just save my life, you changed it completely. I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you." Frank cupped her face gently, his eyes filled with emotion. "I love you too, Hannah. From the moment I saw you fighting to stay alive in that river, I knew you were someone special, someone worth fighting for, worth living for." Their kiss was tender at first, then grew in passion as the reality of their shared feelings swept over them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Not someday, not when things are perfect. Soon. When Dunbar is dealt with and you're safe." Hannah's answer was a radiant smile and another kiss, this one a promise of the future they would build together. The next morning dawned clear and full of purpose. Frank rode into town early to meet Marshal Porter's train, while Hannah stayed at the farm with Carlos and Benjamin keeping watch. Elijah had gone ahead to gather the final pieces of evidence they would present to the marshal. When Frank returned mid-afternoon, it was with U.S. Marshal James Porter and a deputy in tow. Porter was a tall, stern-looking man with a graying mustache and the weathered look of someone who had seen his share of frontier justice. Hannah provided her testimony of the attempted drowning, her hands steady as she showed the marshal the rope burns on her wrists that were still healing. Porter took meticulous notes, asking occasional questions to clarify details. "And you're certain it was Dunbar who ordered this?" he asked when she had finished. "His men said so explicitly," Hannah confirmed. "They said Mr. Dunbar wanted to teach me a lesson for refusing to sell my land." Porter nodded grimly. "It matches the pattern we've been tracking. Mr. Yates has been sending reports to my office for months, but attempted murder raises this to a federal concern." He turned to Frank. "You said there were witnesses to the confrontation at the courthouse yesterday." Frank nodded. "Half the town saw Dunbar try to intimidate Miss Daniels. And last night, his men came here threatening to finish what they started at the river. At least 20 townspeople witnessed that as well." "Good," Porter said, rising. "That should be more than enough to make the charges stick. I'll be heading to Dunbar's ranch now to place him under arrest." "I'm coming with you," Frank stated, his tone brooking no argument. Porter assessed him for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, but you'll stay back and let me do the talking. This needs to be by the book if we want the charges to hold up in federal court." Hannah caught Frank's hand as he prepared to leave. "Be careful," she urged, her eyes conveying all she couldn't say in front of the marshal. Frank squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I will. This ends today, Hannah, I promise." The confrontation at Dunbar's sprawling ranch house was tense but ultimately anticlimactic. Faced with a federal marshal, a deputy, and the weight of evidence against him, Dunbar attempted to bluster and threaten, but his power had already begun to crumble. When Porter produced written testimonies from several of Dunbar's former employees, including one who had been present when the order was given to teach Hannah Daniels a lesson, the cattle baron's facade finally broke. "You'll never make it stick," Dunbar snarled as the marshal handcuffed him. "I have friends in high places." "Not as high as you think," Porter replied calmly. "The governor himself authorized this investigation. Seems your methods have embarrassed some important people in Austin." As Dunbar was led away, Frank felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. The man who had terrorized Desdemona for years, who had been responsible for his brother's death and Hannah's near drowning, looked suddenly small and old in handcuffs. The news of Dunbar's arrest spread through Desdemona like wildfire. By evening, a spontaneous celebration had broken out in the town square, with people who had lived in fear for years finally allowing themselves to believe in a future free from Dunbar's influence. Frank found Hannah in the midst of the celebration, talking animatedly with Maria and Sarah. When she saw him approach, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart skip. "Is it really over?" she asked as he took her hands in his. "It's really over," he confirmed. "Porter says with all the evidence we've provided, plus the testimonies that keep coming in now that people aren't afraid, Dunbar will likely spend the rest of his life in prison." Hannah's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I can hardly believe it. Just a week ago I thought I'd lost everything, my father, possibly my farm, and now—" "And now," Frank prompted, his heart in his throat. Hannah reached up to touch his cheek. "And now I've found something I never expected. Someone who dove into a river to save a stranger, who stood up against a powerful man because it was right, who showed me that I wasn't alone." Frank drew her away from the crowd, finding a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the square. In the dappled moonlight filtering through the leaves, he took both her hands in his. "Hannah Daniels, I meant what I said last night. I love you and I want to marry you, not someday but as soon as you're willing." Hannah's smile was radiant. "How does next Sunday sound? I think we've both waited long enough for happiness." Their kiss sealed the promise, witnessed only by the Texas moon and stars overhead. The wedding took place as planned, in the small Desdemona church filled to capacity with friends and neighbors. Maria served as Hannah's maid of honor, while Elijah stood as Frank's best man. Even Marshal Porter returned for the occasion, having escorted Dunbar to Austin for trial the week before. As Hannah walked down the aisle in a simple white dress that had once belonged to her mother, she caught Frank's eye and felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been fighting for her life in the Brazos River. Now, she was walking toward a future brighter than she could have imagined. Frank couldn't take his eyes off Hannah as she approached. The woman who had shown such courage in the face of danger, such determination to protect what was hers, was now going to be his wife. He had never believed in fate until the day he happened to be riding along the river at exactly the right moment to save her. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love and protect each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation seemed to shake the very rafters of the old church. The celebration continued well into the night, with dancing and feasting and more laughter than Desdemona had heard in years. When Frank finally swept Hannah onto his horse to take her home to his ranch, which would now be their home together, they were showered with rice and good wishes. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" Frank asked as they rode away, his arm secure around her waist. Hannah leaned back against his chest, content in a way she had never known before. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied. "And you, Mr. Yates, any regrets about diving into that river after a stubborn woman who refused to sell her land?" Frank laughed, the sound rich and warm in the night air. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." 6 months later, Frank and Hannah stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as workers put the finishing touches on the new barn. The winter had been mild, allowing them to complete most of the improvements Frank had planned for the combined properties. They had decided to keep Hannah's homestead as well, using it for additional grazing land and hiring a foreman to oversee it. The arrangement had worked well, allowing Hannah to honor her father's memory while building a new life with Frank. "Mrs. Vasquez sent word that she's expecting," Hannah said, leaning against the porch railing. "Their first child, due in the summer," Frank smiled. "Good news." Carlos has been walking around town looking like the proudest man in Texas. He glanced at his wife, noting the slight flush to her cheeks that hadn't been there before. "Speaking of children," Hannah turned to him, her eyes alight with joy and a touch of nervousness. "How did you know?" "You've been glowing for weeks," Frank replied, pulling her into his arms. "And you've been turning green at the smell of coffee every morning." "When were you going to tell me?" "Tonight," Hannah admitted. "I wanted to be sure first. The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I went into town." She looked up at him anxiously. "Are you happy about it?" Frank's answer was to lift her off her feet and spin her around, his laughter echoing across the ranch yard. Happy. Hannah, you've already given me more joy than I ever thought possible. And now a child. He set her down gently, his hand moving to rest protectively on her still flat stomach. Our child. A new life we created together. Hannah covered his hand with hers, tears of happiness filling her eyes. I keep thinking about how easily we might never have met if you hadn't been riding along that river at exactly that moment. Frank shook his head, refusing to entertain the thought. But I was, and I'll always be there when you need me, Hannah. That's a promise I made the day I cut those ropes from your wrists, and it's one I'll keep for the rest of our lives. As the Texas sun set behind them, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Frank pulled Hannah close for a kiss that spoke of all they had overcome, and all they had to look forward to, a future built on courage, commitment, and a love that had begun with a desperate plunge into a river, and the cutting of ropes that had bound more than just Hannah's hands. 7 years later, the Yates ranch had prospered beyond what either Frank or Hannah could have imagined. Their family had grown to include 2 children: 5-year-old James, named after Frank's brother, and 2-year-old Elizabeth, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's determined spirit. Desdemona itself had transformed in the years since Maxwell Dunbar's arrest and subsequent imprisonment. Without his oppressive influence, smaller ranchers and farmers had flourished. Frank had taken a leadership role in the community, helping to establish a cooperative that ensured fair prices for cattle and crops. On the anniversary of the day Frank had pulled Hannah from the river, they made a tradition of picnicking on the riverbank, not at the exact spot where the near tragedy had occurred, but at a peaceful bend downstream where the water flowed gentle and clear. As Hannah spread out their picnic blanket while Frank helped the children collect interesting stones along the shore, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the terror of being thrown into the river with her hands bound, to the joy of building a family with the man who had risked his own life to save hers, her life had taken a turn she could never have anticipated. "Mama, look," James called, running toward her with a perfect arrowhead in his small palm. "Papa says the Indians used these to hunt buffalo." Hannah examined his find with appropriate awe. "It's wonderful, James. We'll add it to your collection when we get home." Frank approached with Elizabeth on his shoulders, the little girl giggling as she clutched her father's hat. "Sorry we're late for lunch. Someone wanted to chase butterflies all the way to the big oak tree." Hannah smiled, reaching up to help Elizabeth down. "It's perfect timing. I was just thinking about how grateful I am for this life we've built together." Frank sat beside her on the blanket, his expression softening. "I think about that day often, how close I came to riding past without noticing what was happening in the river." Hannah reached for his hand, her fingers finding the small scar he'd acquired from the knife when cutting her free. "But you didn't ride past. You dove in. You cut the ropes." She leaned forward to kiss him softly. "And in doing so, you not only saved my life, you gave me a new one." As their children played nearby, safe and happy under the Texas sun, Frank and Hannah shared a look of profound understanding, a look that spoke of a love born in crisis, but built to last through all the seasons of their lives together. "I'd do it all again," Frank said quietly. "Every moment, from the river to now." Hannah squeezed his hand, her heart full. "So would I, every single moment." And as the river flowed peacefully beside them, carrying away the memory of that desperate day, what remained was the love that had begun with an act of courage, a love as enduring as the Texas land they called home.